Curious Lloyd.
Even those of us who have never worn a uniform in the military know that serving in combat is hell. Most people have seen Private Ryan, just like everyone else. But while all war is awful, sometimes it gets well and truly weird. The Nazi baby factories. Let me ease you into these creepy war stories with this image of a specially bred Aryan baby being christened in a Nazi ceremony, in which a SS officer is holding a dagger over its body while the mother swears. But it gets weirder, that's for sure. That infant was one of thousands of Lebensborn babies, some of whom were not bred, but were kidnapped and raised in Nazi baby factories. The Nazis were always worried that not enough blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans were being born into the world. So the same guy who orchestrated the final solution came up with the Lebensborn program, in which the purest Aryan stock could be taken and raised as pure Nazis in the luxurious network of homes furnished with stolen goods of murdered Jews. It started with simply encouraging SS soldiers invading Europe to mingle with the locals. The parties on the receiving end were of good Nordic stock. Should their girlfriends get pregnant, Lebensborn houses were there to provide a safe nurturing home for unwed mothers, in which to give birth and raise their babies. Thanks to these welcome arms of love, between 16,000 and 20,000 babies were born and Nazified during the war. And when they couldn't breed enough babies this way, they just started abducting the bluest or greenest eyed blonde babies they could find. To be fair though, some of the kids stolen from the program were actually orphans. Not that getting conscripted into Nazism by virtue of one's paleness and dead parents is a good thing, but at least the kids had food to eat whilst the world was falling apart. Others were voluntarily surrendered by their parents, sometimes just to keep them from the gas chambers, and still others, probably the ones with the bluest eyes of all, like Daniel Craig Blue, were straight up taken from their parents. There was no genetic testing done or anything. The poorest kids just looked the part. The ones who fit in either kept in the program or adopted by German families. The ones who didn't fit in were just sent into concentration camps. Poland thinks they lost as many as 200,000 kids to the Germans this way, but we'll never know for sure, since so many were absorbed by good German families. So, maybe you come from a line of Nazi babies and you'll never even know. The Angel Makers of Nagorny. Not that the Nazis had a monopoly on bizarrely creepy wartime horror or anything. Not all of the perpetrators are members of any army at all. For instance, here is a story about some Hungarian women on the home front who secretly and systematically poisoned 300 people. It all started when during World War I, some lonely Hungarian wives in a small village of Nagorny started screwing some strapping Allied prisoners of war imprisoned nearby. But when their husbands came home from war, something sinister started happening. Returning soldiers started getting a case of the deads, one after another, which is why the village became known as the Murder District. The whole murder-thon started when a mysterious midwife moved into the village in 1911. When the lonely wives of Nagorny got pregnant with their lovers' allied spawn, it was midwife Fusicus who put the kibosh on pregnancies. And when the lonely wives' husbands returned home from war, it was also midwife Fusicus who suggested they poison the men by boiling flypaper, skimming the arsenic off the top of the brew, then serving it to the husbands on a pizza or donut or something. But just to make sure they could do this again and again and again without ever getting caught, they had the cooperation of a village clerk, who was the midwife's cousin, who when a death report came in, was sure to mark "not murdered" on the official records. It was so easy that every little problem came to be solved with arsenic soup, and the fact that you'd think the local flypaper salesman would notice over time, otherwise if nobody else noticed. By the time neighbouring towns figured out what was going on, as many as 300 people were poisoned by 50 different women, with the victims including parents, lovers, aunts, uncles and neighbours, and even children. All because in this one little town, in this one short stretch of time, murdered by poison became a straight-up craze. American soldiers collected human body parts as trophies. During World War II, everyone involved in the conflict had been thoroughly programmed to see their enemies as subhuman during the Pacific War. The exhaustion and shock of constant battle drove American soldiers over the edge. Eventually, GIs started collecting ears for souvenirs. Teeth were also made into necklaces, and skulls were even mailed home as keepsakes for relatives. But things started to get weirder. I'm not excusing them, I'm just setting the stage. I'm talking about some of the newly enlisted being issued hunting licenses at the recruitment office at the time. One read, "Open season, no limit, Japanese hunting season, free ammunition and equipment, with pay, join the United States Marines." So maybe it's not so surprising that the minute the Japanese bodies started hitting the ground during the Guadalcanal campaign, that GIs started collecting ears for souvenirs. and ears were worn on belts, and teeth were made into necklaces, and also skulls were mailed home as keepsakes for the people at home. It got so bad that by 1942 the US military had to issue a decree specifically condemning the practice of stealing body parts for trophies. But by then it was too late. Servicemen had recipes for cleaning skulls, as well as poses with skulls all worked out and everything. The mindset of stealing Japanese bones for fun was already set in stone. Franklin Roosevelt himself had to refuse a letter opener made from a leg bone. It was like the whole country had lost their minds. The only good news concerning the whole national disgrace was that American readers who saw the Life report were outraged, not just at the thought of pictures reaching the Japanese and spurring disgusted rage, which they did. Americans were supposed to be better than that. Turns out they weren't. So among the topics you should never approach with your granddad are gays in the military and Lady Gaga. Be sure to never ask if he brought any souvenirs home from the Pacific. Irma Greece, the hyena of Auschwitz. A lot of people know about the Holocaust and what happened. You have to wonder what would qualify as creepy in the midst of a concentration camp. The thing is, would you even want to know? Well, I'm going to tell you anyway. This is the story of Irma Greece, the Nazi at Auschwitz who got sexually aroused by torture a lot. On the outside, Irma Greece was a teenage Aryan dream, pretty by Nazi standards, dedicated, beefy on the inside. Irma Greece was a time bomb waiting for a chance to explode. Picture this, but with a bejeweled whip, pistol and a set of half-starved dogs who would attack on her command. Imagine this woman shooting people on a whim, using her belt to whip prisoners, then kicking them when they were down, and getting off on it the whole time. Irma Greece loved her job like a white woman loves opera. She got off torturing people, like when she used to whip to slash female prisoners' breasts. Then when the cuts became infected and required surgery without anesthesia, I should mention she watched the procedure in the operating room, enjoying orgasms so intense they made saliva run down from the corner of her mouth. By the time she was tried and hanged for her crimes, Irma was only 22 years old, at the same age as most of us were trying to figure out what to do with our lives. Irma Greece rewrote what it means to be horrific. The Shishijima Incident. During World War II, 9 American servicemen were shot down over the Japanese-held island of Shishijima. One was picked up by the submarine USS Finback, while the other 8 were captured by Japanese. According to eyewitnesses, those 8 were executed, some by samurai sword. That was fairly normal war stuff. What supposedly happened after that is not. As we have well established by now, war does weird things to a person's brain. It is entirely possible, and even likely, that everyone involved in this was a perfectly normal person before the war, so keep that in mind. The story goes that the Japanese army officers hosted a party for the Japanese Navy officers, and they ran out of meat, so the guy in charge told one of his subordinate to get some chemo from a fresh grave. Chemo meaning flesh, specifically the liver. The subordinate did what he was told, and the liver was fried up alongside the steak of all the other goodies of the night. Apparently, the Japanese Navy officers at the dinner were so impressed that they started executing and serving up their own American prisoner of wars, just to show off and be fancy. And the mad thing is, that still wasn't even the worst part. Some of the prisoner of wars were executed before their bodies were cannibalized. Some weren't, as in their limbs were amputated and their flesh was eaten on the spot, on account of the islands not having enough refrigeration to properly store human meat. But, one more thing. Do you remember that pilot who was spared from becoming an appetizer because he was picked up by a submarine after being shot down in the Pacific? Well, that was George Bush. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week. So the same guy who orchestrated the final solution came up with the lesbian... What did I just say? So the same gay... Oh my god, I'm having a meltdown.